Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks.
Afternoon and a warm welcome to you all. Thanks for coming. Just a reminder for mobiles, if you could switch them off as they do interfere with our recording. We record all our meetings and we're on air. The sign up there lets us know that, so we welcome those that may be listening at home or in the office, wherever you are. We welcome them as well to our meeting. Can I also just, at the beginning, to mention an apology from Hugh Mackenzie, and we think of him and his family. Your prayers and thoughts are with them as the tragedy that they've had in their family, and also we, at the same time, thinking of those in New Zealand from Australia that are obviously going through some very difficult times at the moment. So we think of them at this time and wish their families well. Please be seated. Thank you. So I'll note the apology from Councillor Mackenzie. Declaration of interest? No declaration of interest. Appointment of Acting Chief Executive Officer. So we have Shane in the seat. So
I do apologise, Mr Mayor. I missed that one. I do have a conflict for over 15.1.
15.1.
My apologies for not putting my hand up.
That's all right. 15.1, conflict of interest. So 20.1, appointment of Acting Chief Executive Officer. Recommendation. So moved by the Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Cox. You wish to speak to it all, Deputy?
Past record means I don't have to say.
Thank you. Councillor Cox? Any councillor wish to speak to it? Can I put the motion? Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. Then move on to confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 28th of November. Move Councillor Dawkins. Seconded Councillor Harris. Any corrections? Could I have a show of hands for those who are happy to move the confirmation of the minutes? Councillor Soward, Strozzen, you happy to move? Thank you. That's all councillors present. There's no deputations or no petitions. We do have a community report from Mrs Rebecca Hughes. Rebecca, welcome.
Hello, my name is Beth Hughes and I'm the Development Officer of the Playgroup Tasmania in North. I'm here today to share with you all the report on our annual Launceston Teddy Bears picnic that took place on Wednesday the 23rd of October at Launceston to celebrate National Children's Week. National Children's Week is a celebration of children's rights, talents and that is held every October in Australia. On the fourth Wednesday of October, we celebrate Universal Children's Day. This year, National Children's Week was held between the 19th and 27th of October. Each year, the theme of National Children's Week highlights a children's right. This year, the theme was Children Have the Right to be Healthy, Happy and Safe. The event is one of 3 that we hold across the state, and the event specifically targets families with children birth to 5 years. Each year we receive $5,000 from the Children's Week Council of Australia to coordinate and to deliver these 3 events. This is the only funding we currently receive. In June this year we sent out expressions of interest to local organisations and groups, inviting them to be part of a working group to help with the coordination of these events. This year we were fortunate enough to have a representative from Save the Children, BAPCare, Child Health and Parenting Service, Child Health Tasmania, West Tamar Council, Glendew Children's Services and the Northern Early Years Group on our Launceston Working Group. The event ran from 10:30am to 2pm and saw over 1,500 people participate on the day. We had 24 activity providers from local community organisations showcasing programs and services available in the local community aimed at better supporting children and families. We also had a community storytelling space where we heard beautiful stories read by Mayor Albert Van Zetten. Councillor Janie Finlay and Councillor Andrew Dawkins. In partnership with Community Tas, we were able to provide each family on the day with a show bag, with a growth chart, a packet of crayons and information on local services that are available in our community. We are currently reviewing National Children's Week in Tasmania while looking at further opportunities for growth in what we can deliver. Before I conclude, I would like to take this time to acknowledge and thank Michelle Polly and Ainsley Lowe from the Events Facilitation Community Development at the City of Launceston for their support and commitment to ensure our event at the Launceston City Park was a success. If you'd like to find out more about National Children's Week or the work that Playgroup Tasmania are doing across the Launceston community, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for the work that you do, especially for organising that great event in the City Park and organising the great weather this year. It was fantastic, and the children just love it. Moving on to public question time. Questions from the public? Who'd like to go first? No? No question? Yep. Yep.
Glenda King, 5 Scott Street, Launceston. I have 3 questions, Mr Mayor, and I'll give a brief statement and then a question to follow. They all relate to 14 to 16 St George's Square and its current permit for DA 0339/2019. I understand that over the last 10 days the conditions of the permit issued for that property on the 5th of September 2019 for the demolition of 14 St George's Square have been breached on 4 occasions, namely the 27th of November, the 2nd of December, the 3rd of December and the 5th. Principally these have involved the lack of provision of tree protection for existing trees, particularly the heritage listed sequoias, while a variety of work was being undertaken on the site. Section 4 Vegetation Management Plan of the permit meticulously outlines these requirements, and none of these were in place on the occasions the breaches occurred. There's also been further demolition of external glass walls, the largest being the 6 metre wide by 3 metre high part of the rear western wall. I understand that council officers responded to these breaches following notification of them. I wish to ask, has council imposed fines on the developer for these breaches, and if not, why not? And can the General Manager, and I apologise I have not updated the position title, confirm whether the conditions of the previously approved DA and its permit, that is, no further work on the site until the fence is rebuilt, is being fully implemented, or have variations to this permit been agreed to with the developer?
Yeah, I think we'll need to take those on notice and we'll get back to you in writing, so we'll take those on notice. Thank you.
My second question relates to, again, to the same site. Given the high level of community interest in the preservation and retention of the historic brick wall, which once fronted 14 to 16 St George's Square, and the demolition of the last substantial section bordering Scott Street around 8 a.m. on Friday the 6th of December, could the General Manager advise if the report that was used to justify the unsafe nature of the wall, and hence its demolition under the Building Act Section 214 Emergency Works, is available for public reference?
Yeah, we'll take that on notice as well.
Thank you. My next one is also relating to that, particularly the design of the new wall. I understand from an email sent out on Friday, December the 6th by Duncan Payton in answer to an inquiry received about the replacement wall, that Mr Payton stated that wall is to be visually consistent with the remnant sections of the original wall and constructed to plans approved by the Manager City Development, Mr Jamieson. Further, Mr Payton states that he and Mr Jamieson have met with the property owner of 14 to 16 St George's Square and the builder to discuss plans for the new wall, and that they discussed, and I quote, discussed our expectations for the replacement wall and what will be required to meet the concept of visually consistent with the remnant sections of the wall. The new wall will include a pedestrian gate to service 14 St George's Square, and this gateway is reasonably considered to form part of the replacement wall. Condition 3 of the permit for demolition states, prior to the commencement of any demolition works, a contiguous wall should be erected for the length of the frontage of 14 to 16 St George's Square, from the existing driveway opening to the boundary with Scott Street. The wall shall be visually consistent with the remnant sections of the original brick fence. End of quote from that permit. Can the General Manager please explain how this new wall design with its pedestrian gate meets the requirement of Condition 3, particularly in relation to replacing the wall that ran continuously across both properties from the driveway opening on to the Scott Street boundary, that was, in other words, fully intact for the entire length of the frontage? And can the General Manager explain how the design agreed to is visually consistent with the remnant sections of the original brick fence, which has since been demolished and which contain no pedestrian gate into that original wall or the remnant section? And how can Condition 3 be waived or amended by Mr Jamieson when our councillors, all of you around this table, voted unanimously for Condition 3 as part of the permit with the intent, and I believe actually and in spirit, to ensure the original wall was rebuilt? And if such a variation is allowed, then should it not come back to this chamber for ratification?
Yeah, we'll take that on notice too. Thank you very much for your questions. Any other questions? No? Yeah?
Mitsuba, 54 N Street, right there. Again, my questions, a couple of questions regarding 1416 St. George's Square. I repeatedly sent emails and sent letters to this council, general manager and Mr. Richard Jameson, whether there is any arborist report, indispensable arborist report about that DA application. And as a stakeholder, I would like to see that arborist report. And nobody answers me, my emails and the letters.
I apologise if you haven't been answered, but...
Where is the indispensable arborist report?
Okay, no, look, we'll have to follow up on that because I don't know. It's the first I've heard of
I
that.
got an email from Heritage Tasmania when they contacted Launceston City Council about this, latest development about this property. And the email, according to the email to me, says Launceston City Council employed an arborist about this property. So we haven't received arborist report. And you say, as a Launceston City Council, there is an arborist report.
Yeah, look, I'll have to follow up on that. Now, thank you. You've asked the question. We'll follow up on that and put it in writing to you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Thank you. We've got the public questions on notice that are there. Under the provisions of the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act, Council acts as a planning authority in regard to the items included under Agenda Item 8, the Planning Authority. So the first one is 8.1, 2 to 4 Hart Street. We do have some speakers. Gentleman, Acting CEO, if you could read out the rules, please.
Only residents or ratepayers or those on the City of Launceston electoral roll may address an item on the agenda. Before speaking, please state your name and address or property owned in Launceston. You may speak up to 2 minutes. No extension of time is permitted. You must speak for or against the recommendation, not ask questions of councillors or council officers, nor attempt to enter into debate with councillors or council officers. Statements can only be made either directly relating to supporting the recommendation or arguing against it. Comment statements are not to be defamatory, offensive or abusive, or be designed to embarrass any person, including councillors or council officers. Statements are not to be repetitive of statements or points already made. Several people speaking on a common position should nominate a single speaker on their behalf. The Mayor may ask a member of the gallery to seek speaking if the above procedures are not followed. Following the hearing of comments from the gallery, councillors will then consider the item.
Thank you, Acting CEO. Tony Dargan.
G'day, I'm Tony Dargan. I live at 1 Hart Street. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my mother, Audrey Dargan, who is the homeowner there. Just got a few points. I've lived in the same place since 1972. It's always been a suburb of people that own their own homes and people that live there for many years, long-term residents. the area at the top of Hart Street has always been a place where neighbours can look out for each other and have done for many years. I think that's something worth keeping in an area. This is the first development of its type in this part of Newstead. It's not really in keeping with any the traditional spacious, family-friendly area that Newstead is. It has a total lack of any support from any of the surrounding neighbours. Nobody wants it here. They wish to maintain their property value and their lifestyle, including their backyard privacy. The development will only benefit one person, and that's in a financial way. This person has no intention of residing at the property, but people that currently live there, we have no choice. It's our home, it has been for many decades. Basically, I would say common sense is that the wishes of the many and the needs of the many should outrule the needs of the individual or the few. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Cochrane.
I'm Michelle Cochrane and I live at 125 Eltham Road in Newstead. My comments address the report. They are not a reflection on the author of the report. After reading the regulations and standards outlined at item 8 of the agenda, together with the report, these documents appear to represent a dialogue between council, its standards and regulations, and the developer. There is little or slight reference to the resident or the individual, the community, our little community of Newstead. Our views were overridden at every step but one, which was the privacy issue, in which the proposed building was moved 1 metre further away from the boundary. This is of little consequence to our objection, which is to the imposition of a large two-storey house into our midst. A long line of trees between 2 and 4 Hart Streets has been removed. No doubt the remainder will go when the building starts. The removal of these trees has already created a privacy issue. The tenants at number 4 keep their blinds drawn most of the time. Before the trees were removed, there were no blinds. What's going to happen when this house is built? Who knows? The absence of the remaining trees will remove the existing leafiness of the area, add to the creation of a heat sink in summer, impede the circulation of breezes and lead to poor ventilation. Surely this is the opposite of what should be happening to ameliorate the effects of climate change. Any set of standards and regulations that deem it reasonable for a household to be denied sun and sunlight into its main living areas from 1 p.m. daily is, in my opinion, cruel and punishing, Dickensian almost. Launceston has a cool, temperate climate. Sun and warmth in winter is essential. If this application is approved despite the excessive shadowing of 44 Olive Street, it will not only impact upon the privacy and amenity the residents now enjoy, it will also impose a financial burden on them for additional heating to warm their home. This doesn't sit well with Council's stated desire for affordable and sustainable housing. Please do not approve this application.
Warren Dawson.
Warren Dawson, 125 Eltham Road. Councillors, it's a good thing that Council states that it values clear and open communication with the community, because it is precisely that which is missing or marginalised both within the report and within the representation process. For example, as a community group, we were unable to find on Council's website any guidelines for submitting a valid representation, which would have saved us all a lot of time and anxiety. We were also confused by terms in the report such as acceptable solution or reasonable opportunity, which we used to dismiss all of our relevant representations, even though we had not been provided with any operational definitions of these terms or of their opposites, or of the specific historical town planning environment in which these terms were defined. We know that there was a move towards increased urban density in the 1990s, but nowadays, as my neighbours will attest, people just want space, light, breezes and trees, not increased housing density that takes these things away and contaminates our community with construction noise and dust. By what standard metric, for example, is situating a 7-metre high building 4.722 metres instead of 3.5 metres from a neighbour's side boundary deemed an acceptable solution to visual intrusion? It would still look big to me. What standard metric of reasonable opportunity ensures that a dwelling situated 3.5 metres from the boundary will, quote, provide reasonable opportunity for privacy, unquote. If it has windows that are 2 metres above the boundary fences, I would still hesitate to go outside in my pyjamas. Council is entrusted with statutory authority to make an administrative decision regarding this development application, which will adversely, in our view, and directly affect the interest, status and expectations of the residents who are opposed to it. Therefore, in the interest of procedural fairness, we ask that Council consider in its decision the will of the majority to preserve the character of their neighbourhood and their right to quiet enjoyment of their properties. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce Flood.
I'm Bruce Flood. I'm a colleague from Sydney, a family friend of Brian Brazendale, who has been a resident of 2 Hart Street for the last 36 years. 1984, Brian bought his premise in 2 Hart Street. We also have neighbours, Audrey, who has been a resident of Hart Street for 51 years. Okay. We have another neighbour at 125, and he's been there for 7 years. So we have in Hart Street neighbours who have been there for nearly a century. And these are people with roots. Okay. We have new welcome guests from Queensland and a young couple in Olive Street who are starting their roots. And then we have an Airbnb on the corner of Hart and Olive Street, and the new premises at 4 Hart Street that are rentals. And rental people, as in the Airbnb, will come and go. The new building that is yet to be built, the new neighbours, rentals. Their roots are not there. And we're concerned about the roots that we have and how that'll affect us in the future.
Thank you. Caroline Hine. To be read by Nathan? Yes. Or not?
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name's Nathan. Is that coming through all right? Sorry. Nathan Talbot speaking on behalf of Caroline Hine. The proposed building is too high and will completely overlook our property. It is referred to in the Building Inspector's report, page 19, bottom, as a unit, which it is not. It is a double-storey, 3-bedroom, freestanding house with a double garage on an extremely small block. The second-storey windows will look straight into our outdoor living area, the deck at the back of the house and the kitchen. We spend a lot of our time outdoors. It is where we cook, eat, live and relax and enjoy time together, particularly in the summertime. These windows will compromise our privacy and will add additional stress and anxiety with the thought of being unable to avoid being watched. When we chose to buy this house, we were mindful of the houses and the area around us. We bought our home because of the quality of living we would have, the quiet and green space around us. But this new development is being forced onto us. It may meet the council's guidelines, but not the spirit. People will see into our living space and we worry about our privacy, not the look of the building, but the second-storey window overlooking our living space. The water tank on the side of our shed, installed to save water in these dry times ahead, is in direct line of sight to the second-storey windows. There is no room to plant any trees. This proposal will add no value aesthetically or financially to the area, existing homes or their present residents. We are concerned that the loss of privacy and the added congestion to our street will negatively affect our quality and life value of the property. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Now yourself, Nathan Talbot.
I'll keep mine very short. We live at 44 Olive Street, which is potentially the most affected property of this whole thing. Essentially, we don't want it to be there because, you know, we walk out our back door, we drive down the side of our house where our living room, our kitchen, our lounge room is, and it's where we live, cook our meals. You know, we draw our sunlight from that. It will be overshadowed from the sunlight point of view. Our deck will be completely shaded by, I believe it was 3 p.m. You know, when you walk out your door, you don't expect to find a double-storey, 3-bedroom townhouse, double garage within 3 or 4 metres of your back door. So essentially, that's it for me. The visitor parking, I believe, will be quite an issue, and I just, you know, we're totally against it based on those facts. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the speakers I have. Anyone else that? No? Thank you. So we have 8.1. Is there a motion one of the councillors likes to put? Councillor Finlay moved. Seconder. Councillor Spencer. Councillor Finlay, wish to speak to it?
Thanks, Mayor, I do. And I think it's noted by the gallery the hesitation at the moving and seconding of the item, although it has occurred. I think there's a few questions that have been asked or a few statements that have been made in the gallery that are useful prior to speaking specifically to the development application to address. There's nothing more challenging as a councillor of the City of Launceston, where we have a set of values and a community vision that we're implementing, that as members of a planning authority, we operate within a really tight framework, and somebody used the word, and make an administrative decision. We have two very discrete and very different roles at council, and often the community conversation around planning items are very difficult for us to make legally when we have regard for the feelings of the community, but a development application may reasonably meet the requirements of the scheme. I think it's useful as council to take on board one of the pieces of feedback in terms of, and I don't know how we would do this, we've got communications people, but being able to provide, I've never heard the request before, and I think it's really useful, a one-pager on how you submit a representation to a DA, or what do you include, or including somewhere publicly the definitions of the Act. Because I know as a councillor that served on this council, firstly for 7 years and now for another 5, it takes a long time to understand the language and to interpret those rules. So that's actually probably useful. The other comment, and something that I learned very early on in my time at council, and there was a couple of comments around disregard for the community in the responses by the officers. There was a statement that it seems to be a conversation between the council, the planning scheme and the applicant. Actually, at a point of real clarity, it's a conversation between the planning scheme and the application, and in fact there are no people in the decision. I don't like saying that, and I know that I'm not saying that people don't matter. However, a development application is for a property, and that property may change hands over time, and so we have to make a decision based on what's okay for the property and the surrounding properties. And I use all that as a little bit of an introduction because today as a council collectively we're faced with a decision to make which, when assessed, particularly with the amendment in response to representation that there was a shift in the setback, that reasonably meets the requirements of the scheme. Council go through a lot of training to really understand their legal responsibilities, and as recently as last week we had another planning session that outlined really clearly our responsibilities in decisions like this. I'm uncomfortably willing to stand up and be the person that moves this because I know it's not necessarily something that's favoured by the community, but when looking at the application and the assessment and the requirements of the scheme, a legal decision is to be made, and it is determined that it should be supported today.
Thank you. Councillor Spencer.
Thanks, Mayor. I went and seen this one this morning. It's a very hard one. I've just got a couple of issues in Hart Street. There's only one side parking, one side's no standing. This is a 3-bedroom property. If there's children grows up there, there could be 4 or 5 adults at this property, and it could be 4 or 5 cars. There's only 2 car spots on this property. I don't know which way to vote. It's a very hard one, but the car parking for the visitors could be a problem too. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Question?
Thank you, Mayor. A couple of questions. In one of the representations, there was concern that residents had not been alerted through the proper mechanism with regard to being notified of the development application. I'm just wondering if we're able to answer that question with regard to neighbouring properties being properly notified.
General Manager first. Duncan.
There we are. Thanks. When we notify people, we're required to do it through the requirements of the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act, and that was taken. It was undertaken in accordance with those requirements, which was 14 days public notification.
Thank you. So those abutting properties would have received personal notification as well?
Yes, so under the Act, we're required to send out notification through a letter to all directly adjoining, and as council, we have a policy that we also send out to two over. So the adjoining and then the adjoining again.
Great, thank you. There is some concern with regard to this development application being used into the future for the purposes of Airbnb. Notwithstanding, we have to be careful not to be making derogatory comments about the large number of people in our community who choose to rent a property. So not referring to rentals, but referring to future use in the form of Airbnb. What further provisions would be required if part of this DA was to be used subsequent to what's being considered today for the purposes of Airbnb?
Duncan. General Manager Hurst, or just this?
Sorry. It would depend on how they want to use it if they wanted to use it as short-term accommodation. The government has what's called a Directive 6, which if the person residing there is renting out rooms as an Airbnb, there is a potential for exemption. However, if they weren't, they'd possibly need either a permitted pathway or a discretionary application.
Thank you, and appreciating that you're the person answering the questions and this isn't personal. So I've got another couple of questions, and that is with regard then to parking. Should the applicant choose to have this assessed today in accordance with the scheme under which it falls, and then choose to use a part of the premises or indeed all of it for Airbnb purposes or short-term accommodation, knowing that there isn't enough parking at the moment and knowing that there won't be necessarily provision in a future use to accommodate any parking that would be required subsequent to what's being considered today, what ways would we deal with that provision, given that it's not being adequately met, being able to be adequately met today?
Ian, is that right? Or General Manager Hurst? No?
Give it another shot. For visitor accommodation, you're only required to have one car parking space per holiday unit. So if they were to rent out the entire place, they'd have sufficient car parking.
If indeed, though, the separate component, the smaller component of the premise was separated and so there became two, would they still only need to provide one parking spot?
General Manager Hurst.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm just trying to understand the question. There's various scenarios that could happen, and I'm not quite sure I understand the specific scenario that you're requesting an answer to.
Okay, so the opportunity exists for this development application to be approved today as a residential dwelling. There is considerable concern based on, first of all, the existence already of an Airbnb property in close proximity that a component or all or two parts of this proposed dwelling could be used for short-term visitor accommodation, and there's concern that should that happen, that there would not be enough parking. And I guess concern that the residents who have raised objections to this as a residential application would not have adequate provision to raise their concerns subsequent to what's being considered today should the use change.
You should be listening to the person asking the question. So, General Manager.
I think the answer, if I understand the question correctly, if it's rented out, or if a permit is granted to use the entire property as an Airbnb at some point in the future, it requires one space, in which case it would comply. If the occupier lived there and was renting out a room as an Airbnb, no permit is required under the planning scheme, and so the provisions of the residential standards would apply. This has two spaces plus potentially opportunity to park tandem in the driveway. So what we're approving today would be sufficient for two spaces because there's two spaces being proposed. In a circumstance where there is multiple cars, that may be not sufficient, but it does meet the reasonable standards of the scheme for a three-bedroom house. Two spaces would meet that. The visitor space kicks in because it's a multiple dwelling requirement, and ordinary residential developments don't require visitor spaces.
Further questions? No?
Not at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Harris?
Thank you. There's been a couple of questions or comments made by Nathan, particularly who lives at 44 Olive Street. So my question is in regard to the part of the building that would overlook his backyard, looking at the northwest elevation. I think I'm looking at the right one. The plans seem to indicate that basically the living areas will be on the ground floor and the bedrooms will be on the first floor. And so it would be, if you've got a 1.8 metre fence, those on the living area would not be looking into your next door neighbour, but clearly from the upper story you could. And so the windows that are in there, can you just tell me how high they are off the floor, and perhaps whether any of those have in fact opaque glass to stop people looking through them, to help address his concerns in regard to those in the upper area actually overlooking? Because I think it looks to me on the plans like they are small windows and are probably at least 1.4 or 1.6 off the ground. So I just need to understand what I'm looking at.
Thank you.
If I can.
General Manager or Ian?
I don't have the exact measurements of how high the windows are off the ground level. If we had to guess, I'd say it'd be 1 or 1.2. None on those, or no windows are proposed to be opaque. But I guess what we look at there is, with regard to privacy, is the acceptable solution, which requires a 3 metre setback from all boundaries, which this has met. The top story on that level is set back well beyond 3, so it'd be meeting that acceptable solution.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor. I do have questions, actually. I'm not rising to speak to this at the moment. When it comes to parking, I note that in the report, and I have to go back to that place now, if you just bear with me. Under the proposal, it states that the development will include a double lock-up garage for the purpose of the unit and a visitor car parking space. That's correct?
Excuse me.
That was the original proposal, yes. And through the proposed amended plan condition, that's where the visitor accommodation, the visitor car parking space would be removed.
Right, so that's no longer the proposal, what is written here, is that?
Well, no, that is what's proposed, but we've included a condition that would amend that.
Yes, but it's not removed from the report, is all I'm saying, if that's the case. Condition 2, right. And can you just clarify for me, of course this is 2 and 4 Hart Street, 2 Hart Street being included because of the right-of-way. Does that right-of-way automatically transfer over to what would become a strata title? Because at the moment the right-of-way is for 4 Hart Street, not for 1/4 Hart Street or 2/4 Hart Street.
Ian? No? Richard?
Yes, simply.
It does automatically transfer?
We believe
And yet we don't yet have a strata title for these properties?
We're not considering a strata title. We're considering 2 houses on 1 block. This may never be strata titled, and we can't.
So I couldn't hear
this
that.
may not be strata titled.
It may not be.
No, there's no requirement to strata title it, and strata titling is essentially a procedural matter if you comply with your planning permit, but you're not obliged to strata title it.
I understand. But nonetheless, if it was to be strated, then the right-of-way would automatically carry over to both properties?
Well, that would be a matter that's considered in the strata title, but that would be the usual circumstance, yes.
Yeah. It's just that in the report it is listed as that these properties will be known under a strata title as 1/4 and 2/4 Hart Street. So the strata is not in existence.
The council allocates the properties an address because each new house has to have an address.
Yep. And my final question goes to the amenity to do with sunlight, and I know in other zones you state in the report that anything above 3 hours in some zones is considered a loss of amenity and therefore doesn't necessarily comply with the planning scheme. But am I correct in saying in this particular zone it's okay to lose more than 3 hours sunlight? Is that a discretionary matter, or is that a something that there is no limit in this zone?
General Manager, Ian?
You are correct that in this zone there is no set hours for sunlight, such as in a residential zone, I believe, says 3 hours. So really it's a discretion, and it is up to making a call of what's considered reasonable or what's considered unreasonable, and that impact on adjoining neighbours.
Mm-hmm. And from 1 o'clock in the afternoon, then it would seem in the middle of winter, the house at 44 Olive will lose its sunlight potentially for the rest of the day. It would seem, well, unless anyone contradicts that, that's what
that's your statement, yeah.
Thanks.
Is there
That's
a question?
All my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Walker, wish to speak? Oh, I've got nobody else lined up. So.
I was hoping there'd be a few more speakers. I wasn't quite ready for that. I was just going to digest what I was just asking. Yeah, I appreciate the comments of the Deputy Mayor and the line of questioning also that he followed there. I must admit I wasn't thinking along the lines of this being primarily an accommodation business. But if this is to be is to eventuate, then it sort of does bring a whole range of other questions with it. But I do have extreme concerns about the loss of amenity for the people at 44 Olive Street. I appreciate all the representations, and I think they are extremely valid concerns. When, as Councillor Finlay says, we're sitting as a planning authority, this becomes very difficult because we're sitting as a planning authority, we're looking at the rules, we're looking at the guidelines that our planners work under, and they're working very hard to maintain the consistency for everyone who's a property owner in Launceston. And by and large, you can see that this does meet the scheme in that way. My difficulty is with the loss of amenity for 44 Olive Street, and I do still have some confusion over the parking. As much as it's been talked about, it seems as though in here we're saying that there is parking space for one visitor, and yet is it the case that that is no longer the case because the building has been moved? Is that what I'm to understand? So we've lost a visitor car park in that regard. I suppose this highlights, of course, people own property and they want to have that right to develop it as they see fit. But it does highlight an issue that we have that was only going to increase in time, and that is that people do want to develop their assets and maximise their profits, maximise their return, and that's completely understandable. But in this situation, a reasonable person might look at it and think that's a lot of house to fit in a very small area. Of course, we have performance criteria, we have the guidelines, but in this case, I'm assuming that the local residents would have been a lot happier if it was a single-storey dwelling, if it was a smaller, perhaps a one or a two-bedroom dwelling that was more suitable for that size. So it does highlight issues that we face as a council all the time, and none of it rests easy with me. That's all. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. General Manager wishes to clarify. Parking.
Thanks, Mayor. Just by way of clarification, so the proposal that was submitted was for a double garage and a visitor spot. In order to achieve a greater setback to address some of the concerns in the representations, officers have recommended that space be gained, but that loses the visitor space, parking space. So it's not what was in the proposal, but it's the effect of the recommendations. And I guess one other point of clarification while I have the opportunity is that we are assessing an application for a residential development, not for visitor accommodation. So what's currently been proposed is for a residence.
Thank you. Councillor Soward.
Thanks, Mayor. And like previous speakers, I also have some concerns, particularly around the parking and also the loss of amenity that's been highlighted by some of the speakers from the gallery, but also from other councillors. For me, this one's a tricky one too, because with this particular issue, we're seeing something here, Mr Mayor, that obviously when we sit as a planning authority, we obviously have a legislative responsibility, but this particular street, as a number of the speakers mentioned, is a street, an area that has long-standing residents, people that have been there for a long, long time. We heard from some speakers 20-odd, 30-odd years. So when something like this appears, and as Councillor Walker quite rightly said, when someone owns property or comes into purchasing property and owns it, they may have some different views for how that property will be used, and obviously that's where we play an important role. I do share the fears and concerns of residents, as I said, particularly given those that have been there for a long, long time, when they see something like this come up, particularly around the parking. There's numerous mentions in the papers that we're looking at today around things being outside the building envelope. Parking, as I said, has been mentioned. The loss of amenity and the shading have been mentioned. It, to me, in a perfect world, what we'd be considering today would be looking different for what it is, because whilst obviously when people submit a DA, they obviously have the right to, submit what they want. There are a number of things that come through this that have obviously resulted in 8 representations coming to us, which is quite a large amount, and also listening to the residents raise their concerns. They're very, very real concerns indeed. So I'm hoping that there may be more councillors speak. As I said, I'm uneasy. I'm uneasy with what's in front of us. It really is a tricky one. And as I said, and I'll close my remarks with this, just to highlight that point, this is going to be a very tricky thing for us as a council, particularly in areas of long-standing, with long-standing residents living there, when redevelopment and new owners come in and want to do things like this, because this isn't just going to occur in Hart Street.
Thank you. Councillor Dakin.
Thank you, Mayor. I've got some really good friends that live in Newstead, and I'm sure that councillors around the table probably do too. One's in particular live in a 110-year-old house, weatherboard, beautiful old home, and 3 doors down there's a brand new 2-storey townhouse that also looks great. But I suppose my point is that every suburb evolves in every town. We can't discriminate between rentals and Airbnb. Airbnb is not going to go away anytime soon, and the house across the road from this could become an Airbnb. 2 doors in Old Street could become an Airbnb. As a councillor, I support infill development. I believe it's far better than urban sprawl development.
Thank you. Councillor Dawkins.
Thank you, Mayor. My concerns are, I guess my comments are very similar to Councillor Daking. I think it's incredibly important that we provide clarity to people who want to build in our LGA, and we also have to be fair. So the decisions that we have made in other parts of the community, we make them in every community. I'm very heartened to hear so many representations from the community. I'm glad that you are so deeply involved in your community life. That's very important to a town like Launceston. We don't always hear it. We don't always hear the noisy voices, that people have got something to say, because in some communities people don't have the capacity to come and represent themselves and to have these kind of conversations. So from my perspective, while I am always swayed by people's personal stories, I can't help it, I'm human. I have to be fair. I have to make sure that the judgments I make at this table are fair, and across the board I make the same judgment based on the same criteria. So I will be supporting this application today, because in the past we have supported applications that are actually don't give amenity to communities the way this one does. They didn't make decisions based on representations and amend their plans. In this instance, actually, this is what we want to see. We want a development that's caused concern. We want those developers to speak to the members of the community around them and change their plans as a result. This should be a win-win for the community. I understand why it's not, but it should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Deputy Mayor.
Yes, I'll just expand upon the point that Councillor Dawkins has made, because I do think it is an important one. It is, I use the word unusual, it doesn't always occur that a developer is willing to make changes to their application. And I think that is testament to the process in our planning officers and the way that we were able to engage with a number of the representatives who did share some concerns. I hear even that the meeting was a lovely meeting where people, were able to raise their concerns and be listened to, and I also state that that doesn't always happen either. So I do think that is an important point to raise, and the fact that we do have some changes, not nearly enough perhaps to meet everyone's concerns, and the very real issues that representatives have raised. Real issues about amenity, real issues about their amenity, which is important. Their access to sun, their ability to be looked at their ability to go on and live their lives as they have without being scrutinised by people on the upper level. But I do think that that point that Councillor Dawkins has made, whereby members of the community came together, they were listened to, and a very small change was made as a result, is an important one, and we mustn't lose sight of that, notwithstanding there are a whole range of other things that could have occurred or could occur to improve the situation for the neighbours who have very real concerns.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay, wish to close?
Thanks, Mayor. I think it's really important in the final consideration by councillors today that we're not assessing short-term accommodation or Airbnb, that we're not assessing a strata application, that we are assessing an application for a property at the rear of an existing property, that it's been assessed against the scheme and it does reasonably meet the requirements of the scheme. It complies with private open space. That's been an issue that's raised. It is consistent, therefore, with other decisions that we've made. And although it might not be a comfortable decision, nor one that addresses the concerns immediately of the community, is a decision that legally we need to make today.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. Those against? That's 2 against, the rest is for. The motion is carried. We move on to 8.2. We have no speakers for 8.2. Somebody happy to move 8.2? Councillor Harris. Is there a seconder? Councillor Finlay. Wish to speak to it, Councillor Harris?
Yes, I will. Thank you. I wish to move this motion as amended and to include a 11th condition. And I'd just like to bring it to the attention of the other councillors around the table to say that looking at the proposal, there has been a suggestion that we include a car park management plan to be submitted by the developer for the approval of the manager city development to address such matters such as the parking time limits, fees, speed limits, pedestrian safety, landscape and provision of shade on site, as well as on-site parking for staff and accessible parking, taxis, motorcycles and bicycles. So this wasn't included in the original amendment, but it has now been added as another condition. So I'd like to point that out to you at the start, just to understand that the idea is we will have some idea of the amount of staff parking that will be provided on site for this new development. As Councillor Finlay said in the previous...
Just before you do, because it's
sit
slightly
down.
different,
Yep.
I just want to check the seconders happy with that.
Before I consider seconding it, can I ask a question?
Yes, you certainly may.
Can I just ask that?
I'll not be seconded. Well, I need a seconder before we discuss it. So just someone happy to second the motion. Councillor Soward, thank you. Now you may ask a question.
Right. This is my first time seeing it, and I'm just wondering whether the contents of the condition have been drafted to comply reasonably what would be a training scheme car park management plan, as opposed to something that council might do as a council infrastructure unit to manage parking. I suppose my question is it part of this planning application, or is it something separate that council would discuss?
So General Manager or Duncan, or who would like to answer that question?
Thank you for the question. The issue of car parking for the Kmart development or for the Launceston Plaza development it's a discretionary car parking consideration because they're actually providing more car parking than is required. But they haven't made any specific requirement for parking for staff or any of those sorts of provisions, and there's no requirement in the planning scheme for them to do so. However, it is reasonable for us to ask how they intend the future operation of that car park to continue. I think as all councillors are aware, there's been an ongoing change in the operation of car parks. Oh, sorry. I think we're all aware that there's been a change in the operation of car parks over recent years with being controlled by many of the car park companies, which is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. But there is no requirement for specific car parking for staff. What we're asking for here is a management plan of how that car park will work in the long term, and it gives the operators of the facility an opportunity to address, at least publicly, how they intend to operate in the long term. It will link with the planning scheme, but it's not, they could get away without having it, but it's a useful thing to have to provide greater clarity for the ongoing operation of the facility.
So, question, Deputy Mayor?
So sorry, I'm confused. I've lost track now. Obviously, this wasn't the planner's inclusion originally. Are you suggesting that there was an error and now we are including it based on your recommendation, or are we saying that this is a councillor's request for an amendment and your commentary there was just on that?
No, I'm not saying that there was any error. What I'm saying is that we had an inquiry from one of the councillors in regard to provision of parking specifically allocated to staff, which some of the larger shopping centres, or at least the Kings Meadows shopping centre, I believe, has. Mowbray doesn't. This one doesn't. And in response to that, we've pointed out that there is no specific requirement for the provision of staff car parking. However, we are comfortable and believe it's reasonable to ask for the facility to provide a management plan for the ongoing operation of the car park, and within that to address how they expect staff to park, or where they expect staff to park.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks, Mayor. Just to add to that, however, the original recommendation by officer stands, but I understand that Councillor Harris is wishing to move an amendment to that original recommendation.
And we're now discussing the motion moved by Councillor Harris. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Harris?
Yes, I will. Thank you. As I said, this motion, and we, as Councillor Finlay had said, we do have two very different roles here. We are a planning authority, and we also have our role as a councillor. We're looking at this as a planning authority decision, and some of the representations we've received have been, don't allow 12 more shops to be built outside the CBD. It will only further degrade the shopping in the retail environment of the CBD, and things that I guess sit a little bit uncomfortably with some of us, because we may well agree with those comments and sentiments directly as councillors, but as a planning authority, the opportunity, what we must look at is how the planning application has been made and whether it meets the requirements of that planning scheme. And certainly the 12 new tenancies that are proposed to be built in Racecourse Crescent, to me, seem to meet those requirements. The inclusion of understanding where the parking for the staff, I think, is important, as it has been out at Meadow Mews. Personally, as I said, I don't like the dilution, shall we say, of the retail area of the traditional CBD, but that is the changing nature of retail. And it will be up to the current CBD property owners to perhaps meet the market and I guess understand who their clients are, and also make sure that they are meeting them as a landlord, where someone might feel that their current tenant will be stolen off and taken to Kmart. I really don't think that the Kmart are going to give away these new shops, and so it very much falls down to the current owners to perhaps meet the market, and that may be at a lower rate than they've been getting at the moment. That is the nature of our economy. It is the nature of how we work here, and as I said, as a planning authority, we just have to look at the rules and interpret the rules as they are. So I'm quite comfortable in moving this motion as it is, but personally I do have some concerns about the number of retail shops, and I've expressed that on many occasions, and feel that perhaps the CBD and the retail area does need tightening up and introducing more residential, but that isn't the question being asked today. The question today is, are these shops meeting the application of the development application out at Racecourse Crescent? And they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Soward.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I'm really happy with the addition, and Councillor Harris did speak a little earlier, and very happy to support that. The only thing I wanted to add, I guess, was to reinforce the importance of that last part going into the item for us to consider. Because as we know, we've got an area where this is situated, where it's on the fringe, I guess, of the city. There are a number of residential properties around the area. And one of the things that we see, and I know Councillor Harris has been a very, very strong advocate in other parts of the city where we see parking spilling out of a shopping centre, actually spilling out into residential areas and impacting on people's access, people's amenity. There's also obviously the issue of staff parking and, as we know in Guy Street, as Councillor Harris highlighted, in that particular shopping centre, creating some challenges around safety. This area where this development is scheduled for and we're considering today is a fairly busy area. Obviously it's the home of the Kmart and the Coles complexes, both very highly patronised. Kmart itself, I think 24 hours, so it's fairly busy down there. I share Councillor Harris's raising his concerns with the dilution of retail in the city, but I do note, and that is something he captured in his remarks around the nature of retail today. The nature of retail today. Retail today suggests where there's a shopping centre that people do like a range of stores in there, and it's nothing different to what is seen in other places, in other cities and towns in Tasmania and obviously on the mainland. So to me, there is a bit of excitement with it as well. We've got people that believe in investing in our city, which I think is something, Mr Mayor, every person in this around this table, I'm sure, support the concept of people investing in the city, particularly when we know there are challenges in the community with businesses potentially leaving. We've got someone coming in wanting to spend some money and secure some new tenancies there, which I think is a really good thing. But I'll finish my remarks by just saying I think I'm very happy with this, and we didn't have any representations either, I don't think, any speakers, I should say, today on this one. But that last condition I think is really, really important, and it spells out really, really clearly the purpose that serves in keeping people safe, but also accessibility and also managing the parking through that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Harris? Sorry, Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor, for my correct title. I did just want to sort of not just reiterate what Councillor Soward said, but yes, the market will decide these things. It is unfortunate that, as a city, we've learnt that one of our major retailers in the city, is in trouble and may, possibly no longer be there, depending on how things eventuate. But I did want to, express, just my thoughts are with those people who work with Harris Scarf, and this is not an easy time for Launceston if potentially a major trader in the city were to close. Having said that, I agree with Councillor Soward that it's good to see this investment in the city. The market will decide to some degree, and if this particular operator has that confidence in our city that there's room for this development, then that's a great thing. And I commend Councillor Harris for the inclusion of his amendment, his encouragement of the council to include more provisions there in terms of parking. I think that's well thought out, and it just means overall we have more opportunities in our central business area with which to explore and to expand, and that can be a good thing. And I'm sure the council will, work fastidiously in that direction. But I'll certainly be supporting this motion.
Thank you. Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Harris, that's what I was going to say. Could you like to close?
Thank you for that. Yes, I'd like to thank the other two speakers this afternoon. And yes, the positive is, in fact, investing in this city is it's good to see. Confidence in Launceston is much higher than it has been for a number of years. The changing face of retail is real and it will continue to change. And I just hope that the CBD operators get together and actually meet this challenge head on and make the centre of Launceston even more exciting into the future than perhaps what they have operated on in the past. And, you know, I think that's a positive that can only come out of good competition. So with that, I'll sit down.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. That is all councillors present. That is carried. Council now no longer sits as a planning authority. So we do move on to Mayor's announcements. First thing I just want to say, I got an email today from the commercial manager for the tour of Tasmania, just thanking our council, so acting CEO, thanking our council for the support and thanking also myself but also Councillor Mackenzie, who went up there on the day to help with the stage that we had in Launceston. So they say it was a very outstanding success, and the riders and the support crew that were here gave a lot of good feedback for what they received, and they really enjoyed their time in Launceston and Tasmania. So that's great to have, and they are going to give their form in to us hopefully fairly soon. Also, it's just been amazing time with lots of college productions, with Launceston College, the Dance Fever Grit, but also some assemblies, and they're always pleasing to go to these events, especially a lot of the assemblies when you recognise in our community we have so many gifted and talented and bright and educated young people who are doing absolutely amazing, and it's really great to hear them and to hear their speeches at times and to hear the way that what they've already doing in our community. So very positive signs for ahead, and it's I would have thought 90% plus of people. It's just absolutely fantastic. Also to the World Fly Fishing event that was held here for over a week. They had some incredibly disappointing weather. Quite amazing. It was sleeting, snowing, and yet to go and talk to them at the end of the event, and they had an amazing time, and they are all extremely positive. They loved Launceston, they loved the scenery when they went out to do their fishing, so they all spoke very, very highly of coming here despite the weather, so that's very positive, that the weather didn't get them down. And they said, to most that I talked to and to the organisers, it was one of the best, if not the best, organised World Championships they've ever had. So great credit to all those involved, and thank you, because that obviously is fantastic news for going away from people leaving here and talking about our city and the region, so hopefully many will come back in due course. So that was fantastic, and then for myself just to say that it's a pleasure to continue to support Council and the events that we have, and looking forward to continuing to do that into the future, because these events are so well organised and our staff do an amazing job. So Acting CEO, if you can pass that on, or General Manager can pass that on to all our staff. Appreciate it, because the feedback that I get time and time again from each event is the way that our council supports them and encourages them. So I wanted to say that and thank you for that. Councillor reports. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to comment, whilst a number of us are attending end-of-year presentations at schools, it's also worthwhile noting that Councillor Dawkins and myself have the real privilege of sitting as part of the Council's University Springboard to Education and Scholarship Committee. And every year we provide a scholarship to one fabulous young person to further their education at the University of Tasmania. And this year, the 2019 recipient will be attending our first council meeting next year to comment on her success and the year that she's had at the University of Tasmania. But it's also worthwhile noting that as the Mayor and others go to the local high schools, we do, as a council, present on behalf of the city the Springboard to Education scholarships. And that enables one young student, a Year 10 student at a respective high school, to further their education and to be supported to do so into Year 11, into Year 12 and into their first year of study at the University of Tasmania. And it's another of the many things that we do in that youth space and in that education space. As the Council's representative on the School Association for Launceston College, I want to recognise the outstanding commitment of all the school students and staff who are involved in the production Dance Fever. I highlighted it at last council meeting, encouraging people to go, and then had the opportunity to go myself together with others around the table, and it was outstanding. Not only the students from Launceston College themselves, but also from the neighbouring high schools and importantly from primary schools as well. Some primary schools who had never previously had the opportunity to be part of that event, some from the northern suburbs who are demonstrating the commitment to the arts and their commitment to ongoing education, and it was an outstanding production. And Mayor, I did want to comment that in your list alone of Mayor's announcements, there are so many arts and cultural things that are listed. And as we embark on the launch very soon of our hotly weighted cultural strategy, my word, it's been baking for a very long time and it continues to have the icing applied in these last couple of weeks. It's going to be an exciting forward momentum document when it's launched early next year. That whilst others may not have the same regard for the role that culture and arts plays in our community, this council and around the table and through our offices is committed to the role that the arts and culture plays in celebrating place, in building communities and in providing an economic return to this community.
Thank you. Councillor Soward.
Thanks, Mayor. Just want to touch on a couple of things that you have listed there, just with a little more to share. You summed it up beautifully with your reference to the World Fly Fishing Championships, and I know I did raise that one here before, right at the very start, and none of us around this table would have known the weather that awaited them when they got up to the highlands. 80-kilometre winds, the tropical temperature, I think, of 6 degrees for the first 3 days. But one thing, Mr Mayor, with all seriousness that I will say there's a common theme that pops up on media sites when things go wrong, and that is council needs to do more. That's a phrase that pops up, and I see Talia smiling because she knows it's there. The couple of events that I've just highlighted and all those others, Mr Mayor, that you mentioned, the World Fly Fishing Championships, in attending the dinner on Saturday night, there were 450 people in the Albert Hall from all over the world. 450. A number of them are volunteers from our community. Like you raise all the time, Mr Mayor, we're very lucky to have such a strong volunteering culture where, in that situation, there were people who took a week's leave or 10 days leave to go and volunteer and act as guides, controllers, drivers, help in all contexts in that weather that you highlighted for no pay. So that says a lot about the commitment that our people in our community have. I come back to my theme about doing something. That event, some might think, oh, well, you know, it's fishing, who cares, you know, whatever. 450 people attended the dinner, 140 competitors, some of whom came over to Launceston to stay 12 months ago before the event. Because, Mr Mayor, a lot of people probably don't realise in that context, in that sport, it's a sport in Europe. There are people who are professional at that sport. That's their job. So the money that flowed into our community from that event, I couldn't put a number on it. So on one hand, we've had all this wonderful volunteering where people have given their time. On the other, we've had people staying in accommodation, spending money in our retail shops, our food shops for a period of time, potentially for some over that year period. So it was a wonderful event, and I'll be looking forward to being here again next year, as I told the organisers, and they laughed. But anyway, that's okay. The other thing I wanted to highlight just briefly, Mr Mayor, when we talk about economic benefits for the community, was the Stan Shaker Classic. Once again, a very common theme. Volunteers contributed, and Councillor Mackenzie, a long-term volunteer on that committee, others in our community volunteering to make what was a wonderful event. We had cyclists who are in their field, Mr Mayor, world-leading cyclists, people who have been in the Tour de France, the Tour of Spain. And again, the economic benefit for our community is huge. So for those who say council should do this and council should do that, let's have a look at the wonderful events, and the Deputy Mayor highlighted all the cultural events, all the events that happen that bring people into our city, that encourage them to come back and visit, that encourage them to spend money, that encourage them to enjoy what is Launceston, and also give many, many opportunities for our volunteers, our people to volunteer and serve their community and get some enjoyment out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dawkins.
Thank you, Mayor. I was delighted to attend the Design Tasmania Awards on the 29th of November, along with yourself. What a fantastic night that was. What amazing work. There's just a couple of awards I'd like to speak about. The Premier's Award, the combination of For the People, the branding organisation, and West Coast Council. I'm not sure if you've read about it, but I'd never seen anything quite like it. And I'd just like to point out to Councillor Daking as City Prom Rep, a fantastic way for people in a community to be able to use online resources, to be able to have a common vision and a common kind of theme and brand around what it is that they do. So you can go online, you can choose to make your own logo based on various combinations that you've got. You can build a whole branding campaign for your organisation. Cost you absolutely nothing because it's been provided for by council and by other partners. And it was a way to be able to kind of share that kind of unity of purpose for an area in Tasmania which doesn't often get visited. So I'll talk to you about it later because I really think there's something in there that, especially with the branding work that we're doing here at Council as well, there's a real synergy there, I think, and it's a gap that we've, I think, experienced for quite some time. How do we get all the retail traders to have that sort of sense of unity of purpose and to move forward into the digital age, which we're clearly in? The other award, which actually brought the house to tears, and especially the recipient, Jane Bumford, for the work she'd done on, she's a ceramics artist, on building the spawning spools for the spotted handfish that live in an undisclosed location in the Derwent, because we have to keep it private because there's such a small population left. They're under so much threat that CSIRO scientists have worked with a ceramics artist to build these spawning spools. What they were using in the past was plastic, and they were very concerned about putting plastic into a river which was already polluted. And so this is where science and art can come up with a solution. The artist was moved to tears. She was so delighted with, because her work in the past had been a sense of self-expression, and here is something that she's doing that can actually resolve a serious environmental problem. So I've said before, and I will say again, that the only way that we are going to get where we need to go as far as climate action is we have to enlist our best and brightest, and some of those people will be creative. We can design our way out of this, but we need to start moving through, and I think that award on that night showed a real clear pathway for scientists and artists to work together.
Thank you. Thank you for your role you play with the Design Centre as well. Councillor Dawkins. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, just to mention a couple of things that you've already mentioned. The Launceston Cycling Festival launch on the Friday night, along with the Stand Shaker Criterium on Sunday, resulted in the cycling being on both the front and the back page of the Monday Examiner, which I think is a great thing for cycling here in the city. It certainly brought a lot of people into the city on Sunday, and it was a great event, as they put on by local volunteers. The Tomorrow Together, I'd just like to add my congratulations to the council for the work they did on Saturday following the Christmas parade. They kept some of the streets in Launceston closed under the Open Streets campaign, which some people thought was a bit interesting, but I think it did show the potential of the CBD to have no cars in it for a few hours. The world didn't stop. People still managed to park outside the CBD, and in fact it made for a very pleasant experience for those of you who did make it into the city, whether it was to watch the Christmas parade or in fact to just enjoy shopping thereafter, which is what I was doing. And finally, I will mention that I attended the Startup Boot Camp in the renovated Macquarie House on Tuesday night. This was an annual State of Tech address of where technology is in the world. I won't go into everything he said because he only had 200 slides and we don't have enough time, but it was a most interesting presentation, and should he ever make it back here again, I can only recommend that you perhaps take a time to read or go along, but if not, perhaps look at his slide presentation online. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other councillor reports? Questions from councillors? Councillor Finlay, is that a question or was that a...
Well, it's not a question from councillors, it's a question.
Thank you.
My question's to you. I just read there's a number of people in the gallery, and I'm suspecting it's for almost the last item on the...
18.3 probably. You can move it forward. Yeah, happy for that. You like... I've only got one. But if you'd like to move, it's seconded by Councillor Soward. All those in favour that we move forward 18.3? That is all councillors present. So we now have 18.3. We do have a speaker, Rosalind Ives.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rosalind Ives, and I'm from West Launceston, and I'm speaking this afternoon on behalf, as the Vice President of Hands Off Our Gorge, which is the Cataract Gorge Protection Association. Hands Off Our Gorge thus congratulates Council for developing a procedure that evaluates unsolicited development proposals for council-owned land against important criteria. The criteria giving weightings that rightly most highly prioritise the following: Aboriginal cultural values, heritage and natural environment significance, alignment with community vision, values and sentiment, and tangible community benefit, not just private commercial gain. We feel confident that the Launceston Skyway proposal, judged against these criteria, would fail the assessment. We therefore trust that councillors would, as requested in our petition, signed by 4,540 people and counting, withhold landholder consent. Council has proposed a thorough, fair and comprehensive assessment, a procedure that also includes a phase of community engagement by independent facilitators. We certainly will be continuing our determined community resistance to this inappropriate Skyway development. Hands Off Our Gorge would like to thank councillors for the respecting community values and taking the time to set in place a suitably stringent procedure. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the only person I have speaking, so we'll go on to 18.3. Somebody happy to move the motion, that is? Councillor Walker, the seconder. Councillor Soward. Wish to speak to it, Councillor Walker? No? No. Thank you. Councillor Soward? No? Any councillor wish to speak to it? No? Want to close, Councillor Walker? No? I'll put the motion. Those in favour? That is carried. Thank you. So we now go back to item questions on without notice from councillors. Any questions without notice? No? We'll move on then. Committee reports, 12.1, the Heritage Advisory Committee. Someone happy to move? Councillor Walker. Is there a seconder? Deputy Mayor, thank you. Councillor Walker, wish to speak to it?
I will, in Councillor Mackenzie's absence, speak to this our meeting of, and I'm having to flick between pages here, the sort of benefits of being on the benefits of being on digital papers. Our meeting on the 21st of November, I shall report back on, and just to say that that we did hear once more from the Tasmanian Heritage Register and the proposed amendments to the registration of the Cataract Gorge Reserve, and that was discussed thoroughly, and that the committee certainly did accept and recommend the amendments to that reserve, and it's noted that it's now to be decided whether council, as the landowner, would like to make a submission in respect to the permanent replacement entry of the Cataract Gorge on the Tasmanian Heritage Register, and that's something that the council will determine. That has been a report that's been prepared for the council's consideration. The council also noted, the committee also noted the work of strategic planning team leader Damien Fitzgerald in specific to his city heart work and how that relates to Launceston's heritage, and noted that he would be leaving the council, which he's now done, and thanked him for his work and his service to the committee. And that's probably about all. It's a very busy committee. It's very well attended, well functioning committee, and it's been a great year to be on that committee. So thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to point out item 3, the terracotta fountain in City Park. It's wonderful to see this. The General Manager, Acting CEO and I and other members of his former staff have been corresponding with regard to this matter for the last 2 years. So I feel very sure that a virtual team that picks up all of that knowledge, together with the General Manager of Leanne Hurst and her team, will see a resolution to that matter. I believe it's some ordering has already occurred and some restoration work, and appropriately skilled people are in train already. So it's fabulous to see that, and the people who brought that to me 2 years ago will be very happy to see it in the agenda today.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Walker, wish to close?
I was going to avoid mentioning the terracotta fountain, but thank you very much, Deputy Mayor, and that has been something of an ongoing discussion, and it's good to see the progress there. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. Move on to 13.1, the workshops. We have Councillor Finlay moving, Councillor Dawkins seconding. Wish to speak to it, Councillor Finlay? Councillor Dawkins? Any councillor wish to speak? Deputy Mayor.
Just quickly to note the Mowbray Learning site. No doubt we will see on the social media channels of Council later in December and into the new year an outstanding video celebrating the incredible work of the people in Mowbray, the students, the facilitators, the energy and enthusiasm of those living and working in Mowbray, together with the great work of Sarah McCormack from our community place. Placemaking team. So we look forward to that hitting the airwaves.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay, wish to close? Can I put the motion? Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. 14.1, Councillor Walker, wish to move? Is there a seconder? Councillor Spencer. Councillor Walker, you wish to speak?
Yes, I do, Mayor. Thank you. And I suppose councillors have had enough time to have a look at the motion that I've put forward and hopefully have a good understanding of the reasons why I've put that forward, but I certainly will go through those. I know that there's some in our community who'd like to think there should be no height limits for buildings anywhere in our fair city, and, you know, that's an understandable, opinion to have, but there's also those who, have a fairly diametrically opposite view that there should be extreme governance over these things. Of course, Launceston is, apart, for being known as a livable city, it's also known for its contiguous period architecture. Probably one of the finest examples in the country, especially, well, not just for a regional city, for any city. And of course, I believe that we owe it to our residents, to lovers of heritage, and of course to our developers, that we are able to provide some certainty around how we can develop our city for the benefit of everyone. And I think we're all eager to see investment in our city. It's interesting that this has come up today when we're talking about a development application for a second dwelling on a small block, for example, where we're put in a position where it's very difficult. It's a hard task to sit around this table and make those decisions based on the current planning scheme. And I suppose this motion goes towards that to some degree by looking at the opportunity for us as leaders to take on these challenges for Launceston, so that when development applications come before us, we can take the lead in the discussion about these things because we've done the groundwork. And this motion is about setting that groundwork. I am fully aware that we have a report from Paul Davies, an exceptional report that I'm in firm support of, that addresses these issues by and large in our central business district. But I don't believe that the request I'm making today in any way negates or complicates or contradicts that. In actual fact, I think this can travel alongside that, because what I'm wishing to refer to, and I must admit I probably haven't made it specifically clear in this motion, is that I'm looking to apply this to Greater Launceston, probably more likely areas outside the CBD, because areas within that area, precincts within that area are most likely to be affected by development. So that is where the majority of our heritage buildings are, and also where that pressure is for development to occur. So I appreciate the fact that in the council officer's response to this motion, it's suggested that it is by and large in the CBD where this pressure is. But I'd like to think that we can look outside the CBD and that we can find and identify other areas that could possibly accommodate taller buildings, because like Councillor Daking once said, I like tall buildings. I do too, I'm not against them. But when it comes to creating conflict within our community and angst and pitting business against business, causing, overwhelming agitation in the community, I'd like to think that there's a positive way that the council can move forward, that there is a way that we can explore other ideas without necessarily changing our policy here and now, but by investigating these ideas to see if there is a possibility that we can move forward together as a community. The process that we've followed up until now has created some of these dilemmas where we have a divided community and a divided vision about what our community should be. This is a way of exploring the possibility that we can move forward together. And it's seeking answers in a world that desperately needs them. We, have come to this point in our own history, in our reasonably short history, where livability for our city is potentially being threatened by the pressures of development, the pressures of modern life, and this again is a way of being able to ensure that we make Launceston the most livable city possible. Thank you. That's all, thank you.
Councillor Spencer.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll just follow on from Tim. I agree with all that stuff he said there. I think we need to find alternative areas where we can build high buildings. It doesn't interfere with the general public or other businesses. And not have them in where this is going to affect traffic in flood areas. There's heaps of property around Launceston they could build motels out in the country, like the country club casino, who'd think that'd be such a success after 30 odd years. It's not in the middle of town. And I think Tim's idea is a great idea. Height restriction probably should not be a problem. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Soward.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I don't disagree with a lot of the spirit and intent of what Councillor Walker's brought to us today. I think his passion and advocacy is well known, and he's definitely identified some good points there. But I guess the concern I have, Mr. Mayor, and I'll reference it with an example of something we decided as a council a little earlier this year, is that there is a significant piece of work going on at the moment on the Paul Davies study, which is referenced, and Councillor Walker mentioned it, and it's referenced in Mr. Jamison's detailed and excellent response to this notice of motion. The The concern I have, and as I said, I'll use an example from earlier in the year. I brought a notice of motion to Council earlier this year regarding a review into city prominence operations, and I think that notice of motion came in a couple of weeks, maybe a month, after the Louise Grimmer study was launched, and it was decided to an amendment to my motion, which made a lot of sense, and I supported, that we should let the Louise Grimmer work finish before we proceed down the city prom track, and it made sense, and that Grimmer work then guided the city prom work, and I think that's a good example here. So, coming back to this motion, using that example, the work that's going on, and Mr Jamison's highlighted, this work in the Davies report work has been going on for a significant period of time. It's been a piece of work that, and I say this with all respect and sensibility, it's been consulted within an inch of its life. People have been invited to speak, it's been out there, people have fed back, councillors have had workshops. Mr Davies himself has presented on numerous occasions. It is a significant body of work, and as Mr Jamieson says in his notes here, there's some significant work being carried out, and he's indicated that that piece of work will be heading back to council, to us to have a look at in the early part of next year. He also highlights, and again, very important to note, that if this notice of motion is supported today and runs parallel with that work, that that will take a significant amount of time as well to complete. So, whilst, as I said, I don't disagree with Councillor Walker's intent, and I particularly like his idea of, I'll come back to that in a moment, of identifying areas in other parts of the city, not just in the CBD. I think that the fact, how I would like to see this proceed is for the Davies work to work its way through to completion. Councillor Walker and all of us can have a look at that, and again, if there's some things we need to do in response to that, that would be the time, in my view, Mr Mayor, to pick up the points highlighted very clearly here by Councillor Walker. I'll come back to Councillor Walker's point on identifying areas, if you like, outside the CBD, and I think that that's something that's got a lot of merit to it. And Councillor Spencer, you know, I do love your support and enthusiasm for that. One of the things I guess I've learned is that often, unfortunately, and it's not just in Launceston, it's often in all parts of the world, I'd say, there would be people that would say to us as councillors, we need, whether it's a hotel or a restaurant or whatever, and then in the next sentence it's almost like as long as it's not in the street next to me or in my suburb. So unfortunately, as well guided and as well meaning as our council might be on decisions we make, I'm sure if we look at some special height areas that are set aside at Mowbray, for instance, or at Newnham, that will be well supported by everyone that lives in a suburb other than those ones. So that we'll see. We'll see if I'm right. But anyway, as I said, I like the ideas, but I do think that the work would be better served by having the Davies report come back to us, for that work to be considered by council, and then if we need to go down this track or other tracks that might come up when we read that report, that would be the suitable time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dawkins.
Thank you. As much as I admire Councillor Walker's passion around this subject, you know, clearly this has come as a result of the confusing for the community Gorge Hotel proposal and everything that happened around that. We listened to the advice of planners, and that advice didn't stack up at REMPAT for whatever reason. It's clearly open to interpretation. So as a result of that, Councillor Walker, I believe, has listened to the community and said we need some clear guidelines around where people can build taller buildings. We're not against taller buildings. They just shouldn't be in a place where we have heritage buildings near them. We don't want to overshadow people. We don't want to change their amenity. We don't want to ruin people's lives with tall buildings that are overflowing with tourists. Well, for me, it's not really about the height of the buildings. It's, you know, as many complaints about the Gorge Hotel from individuals in the community that were about the height were about the design, that the design wasn't compatible with that area. I still believe that that area is perfect for a tall building. I think, you know, it's one of the lowest lying areas. I still believe, as I voted on that day, that it would be a good development for Launceston. I believe that's the perfect place to have tourists. They have an opportunity from there to be able to go walk into the gorge, to walk around the city rim, to walk into the city, to make use of our beautiful hotels and restaurants and really enjoy the amenity that this city has to offer. And I believe that any clear and deep investigation would indicate the same, that putting large hotels on the city fringe would not be as attractive to tourists who can visit anywhere in the country. They can stay in the south of the state and not come to Launceston. There's absolutely no imperative for them to do so unless they choose to do so. So it's up to us to make it an attractive place for them to want to visit. So whilst I think that we do have to continue this conversation about heights, we've been having this conversation for many years, I do not believe that height is the only thing that we need to consider, and I believe this motion is too narrow in that sense and also coincides with work that we're already doing. So I won't be supporting it today.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm not compelled to support the motion before us today, and I have a belief that if you're going to vote against something, you should share the reasons why. I think it's useful. As Councillor Dawkins says, I understand the intention. I think there was some clarification provided in terms of being outside the boundary of what the Paul Davies study is doing, and that may be reasonable to consider at some point. However, it was really clear, and Councillor Dawkins touches on it, that height is not the singular concern. It's not a linear question, and in fact, all of the commentary that caused us to have Mr. Davies come back and actually amend and further work was about context and how things actually work. It was about design and excellence. We have done a plethora of work on the boundary that the Paul Davies studies covers, and we're in train for, I think, is what's going to be a really exciting outcome. To then go and find pockets outside that boundary of places that we could build something that is simply tall, I think predetermining where they might be actually limits innovation and big ideas. Actually, anyone can apply to put anything anywhere at any time, subject that it reasonably meets the requirements of the scheme, or that seeks an amendment in therefore that it can be okay in that area. And so without limit, some super exciting things could happen. Not everyone is an advocate, but for instance, with the university's relocation to the centre area of the city, to other developments that we're aware that are happening. So I'm not compelled to support it. I think we're doing a fantastic body of work that we need to see through to its conclusion, and I think outside that boundary, allowing people, either locals or people from a field that can see an opportunity in Launceston and present that for consideration, either as a development application on private land or as we've already been applauded today for unsolicited applications on council land. We have processes, great processes now to consider that encourage and invite innovation and big ideas that we should be open to at all times.
Thank you. Councillor Harris.
Thank you. Like the last couple of speakers, I won't be supporting Councillor Walker's motion today. However, I do think his intention of the motion is noble, and really what I'd say is we may need to do this in the future, but not yet, because certainly for developers some clarity may be necessary. But when I sat and thought of what are the types of things that are going to need, what sort of buildings are going to need to be above height, I came up with 5: hotels, apartments, office admin buildings, university accommodation, perhaps hospitals. There may be more, but hospitals has its own precinct. It's outside the planning area. I don't think we need to necessarily look at that. The university and its area is also outside the precinct that we're looking at, and so it already has its own area there. Office admin buildings, I really don't see that is a future of tall buildings in Launceston. I don't think our local businesses, as well as St Luke's Health or the Bank of Me, thank you. Yes, wrong one. Yes, I was combining my state. Bank of Me might be going. I can't see them needing an office building for 1,000 staff anytime soon. So that really leaves us just with hotels and apartment developments that may well be above height, and most of those are going to end up being in the CBD, simply because that makes sense, as the other speakers said. To put a hotel development further out from the CBD is not necessarily what's going to encourage someone to invest their money there. So I think we have the opportunity under the Paul Davies report to address what is going to come before us. If in some future time, when I'm no longer on this council, this might need to be looked at, I think it will be looked at in a future time, but unfortunately I just don't think it's now. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cox.
And I think that this would, in effect, give them additional work. I was waiting for him to nod to me, but he didn't. So you're supposed to support me, Richard. It's going to give them additional work. It puts more pressure on them. And I think we've contracted somebody to do a job. Let's, out of sheer courtesy, let that person do the job, let them come back. And if we're not satisfied by the time they bring that report back, then look at the motion that Councillor Walker's brought forward. But I won't be supporting it today.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Dakin.
Thank you, Mayor. I, like the other councillors, won't be supporting your motion today, Councillor Walker, but I do thank you for bringing it forward. Like Councillor Dawkins with regards to the Gorge Hotel, personally, that was extremely frustrating for me to see that overturned, but I understand the processes and respect the fact that it did get overturned. Like Councillor Soward, I do agree in regards to the city problem that we need to get the experts in front of us and not have them behind us. I do like tall buildings, and I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it again, but I love my heritage, absolutely, and I haven't met a person, especially in the pub, that doesn't love heritage and doesn't want to tear it down. So, as I said before, we're not the experts, let the experts...
That was another meeting.
Was it?
It was.
Yeah. What is that?
That means they want to tear it
Oh,
down.
let's keep it. My apologies. Just making sure you're listening. Wants to keep it. Want to keep my heritage. I need a beer. So, as I said before, we are not the experts. Let's the experts be the experts. So then, as Councillor Walker said, so we can provide certainty, but more importantly, we can provide opportunity. We don't know what future developers could create. Let's not restrict them before they do.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Walker, wish to close?
Yes, I do, Mayor. Thank you. Just to clarify a couple of things, and I appreciate the comments from my fellow councillors. I had some concern that people would think that this somehow, as I expressed earlier, negates or conflicts or contradicts the Paul Davies report, and I was very carefully specific in my opening statement to express that this is not what it's about. I'm in full support of the Paul Davies report as well. In fact, Paul Davies is someone who does travel all around the world doing these types of consultations for other cities. Cities, in Europe where they do build their modern citadels away from their heritage areas. It's not an unheard of practice. It's something that people who really value their heritage take seriously and consider when they are planning their city. And this is what I would like to see for our planners, is their opportunity to do what they're trained to do, which is actually to plan for this city, not to always be at the behest of one development after another and being compliance officers and not having the opportunity to step forward and find ways that we can make Launceston a better city that includes our heritage, as Councillor Dakin expresses his love for, and also includes modern developments. It's not being so prescriptive as to say that you must build this building in this location. I'd like to think that we could identify, but I'm not even wanting to put a prescriptive tone on it. In actual fact, as you say, we're not planners. Let the planners do this work. They're the ones that have the expertise. They're the ones that have studied this. This is exactly what this motion is asking to do. It's not asking us to be the planners. It's asking our urban planners to do exactly what they're trained to do, and that is to make our city a better place to live, a more livable city. But I'll also address the idea that councillors around the table think that this is merely about the height of buildings. Not once in the motion does it mention building height. Now, that was done purposefully because this is about exceeding the planning scheme on any number of levels, whether it be provisions to do with flood plains, whether it is to do with heights, whether it's to do with setback, whatever it may be. So to limit it to just seeing it as a motion that is addressing heights is, patently incorrect. I agree, we're not the experts. That's exactly why I'm putting the motion forward. That's exactly why I'm putting my trust in our planners to help this council and all of our residents design a better city that we can all share together and move forward together.
I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Those against? The motion is lost. We'll move on to 15.1, deed of surrender of the lease. So I'm happy to move that. Move Councillor Finlay. Is there a seconder? Deputy Mayor. Councillor Finlay wish to speak to it? Deputy Mayor. Any councillor wish to speak to 15.1? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. That is carried by those present. Move on to 15.2, the planning scheme, Tasmanian planning scheme. Is there a mover? Move Councillor Finlay, second Councillor Harris. Wish to speak to it, Councillor Finlay?
Only to outline the contents of a report that we're required to prepare the LPS, that we've commenced the process, and this is bringing it to be adopted by us and then to be reviewed. It's something that we need to do.
Councillor Harris, any other councillor wish to speak to it? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. We then move on to 18.1, proposed street names. Someone happy to move that? Move Councillor Harris, second Councillor Spencer. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Harris?
Only that it's good to see this new subdivision going ahead. The new proposed street names are obviously necessary. The blocks are selling particularly well, from what I've been told. So it's a bit of a win-win. So it's good to have some names on the streets. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Spencer. Any other councillor wish to speak? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. 18.2, another street name. Someone happy to move that? Councillor Harris. There's seconder, Councillor Spencer. Do you wish to speak to Councillor Harris? Councillor Spencer. Any councillor wish to speak to 18.2? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. That's all councillors present. That is carried. 18.3, we've done that. 20.2, Regional Economic Development Strategy. Is there a mover? Councillor Finlay. Is there a seconder? Councillor Harris. Wish to speak to Councillor Finlay?
Only just to clarify that this has been before us on a number of occasions. At the last point that we considered it at workshop, we sent back some quite specific feedback. It was also that feedback was then adopted at the table and we had an audience for that at the time. There's been a clear shift based on our feedback that we've changed it from a plan to a strategy. There will now be a follow-up where we will create a 3-year there will be a 3-year implementation plan created. I suppose you could say it's disappointing that we didn't end up with a plan and that the process sort of took a windy path to get where it's going, and it will therefore now take longer. But I'm not sure that we can do anything about that under the government's requirements to remove certain elements. This is what we've got, and we're stepping through the process today.
Thank you. Councillor Harris. Any other councillor wish to speak to it? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. So we go to 20.3, report on the AGM. Someone happy to move that? Councillor Harris, thank you. Seconder, Councillor Cox. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Harris? Councillor Cox? Any councillor wish to speak to it? Councillor Dawkins.
Thank you, Mayor. Another fantastic report. Disappointing again with the amount of people who came to the AGM. We still keep having that conversation about what's its purpose. You know, we definitely want to be able to share with the community what we're doing, and we're doing a brilliant job of that through socials, I believe. But it's still, you know, it's the same half a dozen people who are deeply connected to what happens at council. It would be great, I think, really wonderful if we could either make it a different event that's bigger in a way that it, you know, has a real purpose, or speak to those people individually, because I don't think continuing to do this year after year really makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Harris, wish to close? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. We're now at the end of it, aren't we? So. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Just checking there's nothing else. So we now have a meeting, a motion to move into closed council as per 22. Move council. Oh, sorry, we've got something that's not on my screen. What are we doing?
This is a procedural motion to deal with the councillor's leave of absence as an urgent item.
So we have to note it in the open agenda before we go into close.
Okay, sorry. As well as the one there, we've got another one we add to it. Is that what you're telling me? Or you want to do two motions?
Yes, please.
Okay, two motions. So the first motion is, well, I've got things across it, as per the screen, apart from all our names on there. Here we go. Determined to consider agenda item 22.3, councillor's leave of absence. Is there a mover for that? Deputy Mayor, thank you. Councillor Finlay, seconded. Any discussion? Can I put the motion? That is all councillors present. And now with that included, we have the motion that we move into closed council as per there with that addition. Anyone happy to move that? Councillor Walker, seconded. Councillor Soward. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. So we'll now go to closed council.
Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused.
Council, and somebody move a motion that we endorse it. Have we got the motion in front of us that we're supposed to have there? Bring it up. There it is, recommendation on the screen. The percentage of that we resolve to report in open session, that is, consider the following matters in closed session, which are closed council minutes, the City Heart and the councillor's leave of absence. Somebody have to move that? Councillor Sauer, second Councillor Harris. All those in favour, please raise your hand. That's all councillors present. That is carried. We'll close the meeting. Thank you. And I think that, did you have something for?
I had a quick briefing that Michael wanted to.
Local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks.